I'm Arata from Clockwork Butterfly, and it's time for our first tutorial. We're going to start with the second group of tutorials, which are production ones. And first of all, we're going to cover resin. These are going to be just the basics of resin as a material, as opposed to details about actually casting it. We will get into that a bit later. First of all, what is resin? Resin is a two-part chemical compound that comes usually in liquid. Sometimes it can be paste or something like that. And when mixed together, these two parts through a chemical reaction form a rigid plastic. Now let me show you what it looks like actually. This is my casting resin. This is the actual resin. This is the hardener, so the thing you mix in with it to make it go hard. That was obvious. And now onto resin in its final form, which you probably know if you are already into BJDs, but these are some resin casts that I made of my doll Endo. This is one of them, and this is another one. So this is basically what you want to get when you're making a doll. Now, there are two kinds of resin I would like to talk about. First of all, there's epoxy resin, which is a lot cheaper, but it's weak and its resistance to sunlight is very low. But because of the costs, you may look into using it for prototypes, for other projects that are not ball jointed dolls. Basically, keep that in mind, but you're not going to make your final dolls out of it. And the second resin is polyurethane resin, which is actually what is most often used for ball jointed dolls. It's about 3 times more pricey. Its resistance to sunlight is generally much better, although it will depend on the particular resin you get, and it's much stronger also. Now, storing resin. It seems very simple, but you really should keep these things in mind because resin doesn't grow on trees and you don't want to waste it. First of all, you should keep it in a dark place. It doesn't have to be pitch black, but preferably a cupboard, or at least, not on your windowsill. Resin can and will go bad if it's left in direct sunlight. Second of all, maybe even more important, dry. It needs to be dry because even the tiniest bit of moisture will ruin your whole batch of resin. Then, another thing is airtight. It's a common problem if you're pouring your resin and you just put the cap on loosely because you're doing something else at the same time, and then you forget about it. Try not to do this. Try always remember, after you're done casting, screw those caps on properly. It may get hard to take them off later, but it's better than wasting your resin. This is mostly because of the moisture thing, because moisture will get into the bottle with the air. Now, also try to keep your resin at room temperature. Another thing I want to cover is additives. There are a lot of things you can add to your resin to change its properties. It depends on the particular manufacturer, so basically just look into what's available for you. There are additives that will extend the working time of the resin, that will make it more runny, that will make it thicker, that will extend its life basically so that you can store it for longer, and additives that will allow you to make resin that is more resistant to sunlight. Some other things, stuff you should use for resin. Now, it's a good idea, especially at first, while you're not yet actually producing your dolls, but just making the junk casts or prototypes or whatever, to get smaller bottles. Once you're producing your dolls, you want bottles that are enough to make at least one whole doll, because otherwise you'll have to dye it separately another time, and you can get it wrong and you can get parts that don't match. But at first it's best to get small bottles. Sorry. At first it's best to get small bottles, because as you're just trying things out, you may want to leave it for a longer time as you work on other doll parts. So this thing I showed you, this is 1 kilogram of resin. Probably won't get 1 kilogram stuff in America because you have different measuring system, but get something roughly this size. This is half a kilo here, half a kilo here. Of course, this is used. This is like 1/3 of what it was originally. Now, in order to mix your resin, get plastic cups, and don't be like me, because I use plastic cups that happen to have some detail at the bottom. I'm trying to show you them, but they seem to have escaped. Oh, here it is. So this is what I use. I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's some detail here and it's a little bit narrower. So once you get leftover resin that solidifies in here, it will be hard to remove it. Which is important because even though these cups aren't especially expensive, you still don't want to waste 15 a day. So you can reuse them. Once resin is set, you can just pull it out. Now with this, it's a lot harder. You have to push it and squish it, and basically it's a lot of trouble. Better get cups with no details at the bottom, just plain simple cups. Now, in order to stir the resin when you mix it, you're probably going to look at wooden stirrers. Resin will get stuck to them, but first of all, you can clean them up a bit right after pulling them out of the resin. Just wipe them with a paper towel, and if something gets left there, that's it, that's no problem. The resin that's already set has no effect on the resin you're just mixing now, so you can just keep using it until it gets so thick with resin that you can put it in the cup. You could also use plastic spoons, and once you get the right kind of plastic, because some kinds of plastic can stick to resin permanently, you should be able to reuse them just like the plastic cups. Another thing is dyeing resin. Typically, you're not gonna want your doll to be the same color the resin originally came in, so you're gonna want to dye it. First thing you're going to look at are resin dyes, which are, as the name implies, dyes made specifically for resin. You're going to have to look at the kind of resin, therefore get, obviously, polyurethane dyes. They can come in a liquid or a paste. This was my dog's nose. He wants cuddles. Liquid dyes are a little bit easier to use. The paste is a bit more troubling, but it's usually also more concentrated, so you won't have to add as much. They may come in handy drippy bottles that you just squeeze and single drops come out, which is awesome because you can use this to measure how much dye you put in your resin and recreate the same color later. If not, you're probably going to have to use an eyedropper or something similar. Again, much like with the cups and the stirrers, this stuff can be expensive if you want to buy it one by one, but get them in bulk, go on eBay or something like that, they will be extremely cheap. Also, a good tip for eyedroppers, don't go to hobby stores. They have them, but they have them super expensive. Get them from medical supply stores. It's the same thing, it's just going to be a lot cheaper. There are other ways to dye resin. You can use dry pigments like mica pigments, which are an awesome thing. I've seen them used, I haven't used them myself, but they're awesome. Sometimes dry pigments won't want to dissolve in resin very well, and then you would have to add something to them to dissolve them first. I've done this with mica-based eyeshadow pigments, which is kind of weird. I've used some alcohol, because obviously you can't use water for it or you'll ruin it. Other pigments, probably higher quality pigments, would be alright putting them straight into the resin. Basically, for all other kinds of dyes and paints out there, there's one and only one rule. Water, bad; no water, good. If something is not water-based and does not contain any water at all, you can go ahead and add it. But basically, I would really recommend dyes. They are significantly more expensive, but they will go a long way. You just put a drop or two and it colors the whole batch of resin wonderfully. Also, dyes are made especially for resin and with UV protection in mind, which means these are pigments which are designed in such a way that they will not fade or change color over time as they are exposed to sunlight, so you don't have that kind of guarantee with other pigments. Speaking of adding water to resin, this can sometimes lead to very interesting results. For example, I have this one head cast where I added acrylic paint, which is water-based, and came up with something like this. It doesn't really pick up on camera so well, but this guy is pretty intense green and he's all bubbly. This is a good example of what you're going to get if you add accidentally or on purpose water to your resin. This is a surface that was cut, so you can see there are bubbles all the way through, which can be a good thing if that's what you're into. Another thing about resin is filler. Filler. I'm sorry. The thing about filler is it has its pros, it has its cons, depending on what you're using it for. The pros are definitely that, back after a break, the pros are definitely that filler is cheap. It's extremely cheap, next to nothing. It adds strength, it adds durability, it makes things less flexible, and it can add UV protection as well. There are different kinds of fillers, some are chemical compounds, some are teeny tiny glass balls, there are different things, and you have to make sure that what you're using is suitable for your particular resin. And there are cons though as well. Filler makes it hard to modify your finished casts, as they are way harder and really difficult to cut through. It makes it much harder to pour. If your mold is complicated, and with a ball jointed doll, you're going to have closed molds as opposed to open molds, so this is really important. The resin is going to end up much more dense and harder to pour into this tiny hole in your mold, and it makes setting faster. Now, these cons can be countered with some additives, which I mentioned earlier, so just look into what's available for you and decide what's best for your doll. Now, safety. Safety with resin is a very big thing. Mostly you should just refer to the manufacturer or seller of your resin. This is my dog again. They are required to tell you straight up on the sales page what kind of dangers come with the resin and how to deal with it safely. Basically, most of the time, you don't need a mask for mixing, pouring, during the setting time, and when you're cutting it like with a knife, an X-Acto blade or something like this. And you're going to use a mask for sanding and drilling. Now, this applies to situations when it's a one-off thing. If you're going to make it your lifestyle, the mask isn't really that much of a problem. You can just wear it. It's not going to hinder you really, and it's worth going the extra mile instead of ending up with some illness later on. So basically, you don't need to, but it's a good thing. Use your mask all the time. I can even show off mine. Okay, this is my mask. It's gorgeous, isn't it? About gloves, generally with resin you do not need any gloves, but you may be allergic to it. So just look, see how you react to it. If you react negatively, get some gloves that you won't be allergic to. So watch out for latex gloves, and I think there are some other kinds that can give you allergies, but basically typically you're not going to use gloves for resin. Now, some common problems with resin. If you're seeing bubbles, as I showed you, that's probably moisture. It can get really difficult to avoid moisture because it's everywhere. It's in the air. Sometimes some resins are more sensitive than the others, and you're going to end up not being able to pour your resin on a cloudy day. That's how bad it gets. And if your resin happens to be open on a cloudy day, it may get wasted. Other resins, not so much. Mine is pretty good at that. I've pretty much poured in the evening, like very moist. Not really. Evenings when there was a lot of moisture in the air, and had no trouble. Only when I physically add water in there do I get bubbles. If your resin is not setting, you should remember to mix the particular parts before you mix them together. Especially with hardener. Hardener tends to get a little clumpy, have some stuff left at the bottom. You have to mix it well. Don't shake it. You don't want to put air in there because that also causes bubbles. Just gently turn the bowl around, back and forth, until you see the stuff from the bottom mixing in. Now, degas your resin. Resins have different working times. The working time is what you get to actually work with the resin, and the setting time is what you have to wait before you can take it out of the mold. Get a resin that has enough working time that you can set the mixture aside for a moment so that the bubbles rise to the top and don't get trapped into your parts. Now, always stick to the proportions that you should be mixing in, except if your resin is old. For example, in my case, with this resin, the hardener is not really working as well as it used to, so I need to use a little bit more of it. So don't be afraid to alter the proportions a little bit if you have trouble with the resin setting. And last thing, I already mentioned it with storage, room temperature. The mold has to be room temperature, the resin has to be room temperature, and the place where you're pouring needs to be room temperature as well. Last thing, buying resin. So things you should look at when you're picking the resin to buy. First of all, times. Setting time and work time, or the other way around. As I said, working time is how much time you get to pour it, and setting times is how long you have to wait and let it sit in the mold. Density. Density affects the weight of the finished product. Most resins will be slightly more dense than water, so have a density of 1.05 or something like that. And that's good. You may want to look into lighter resins if you're making big dolls. You may want to look into more dense resins if, for example, you want to make tiny things that you really, really want to be durable, and you want to have that feel that you're holding a thing and not just something that can fall out and be lost on the way. Something that you will notice that you are actually holding with smaller dolls and may be important for you. Then strength. This is a very general thing. There are a multitude of different parameters that describe strength of the resin. It will be on the side. There will be things describing how far will it bend before it breaks, etc., etc. Then UV protection or durability. There should also be some sort of indicator on the sales page that will tell you how UV resistant the resin is on its own. Then color. You want to know what color the resin is. Typically you want to go for a white resin because it's the easiest to dye. Mine is beige and still dyes okay, but I can't make it white, so that's a problem. Then proportions. As I said, my resin has a 1:1 by weight or by volume ratio, so I can measure it any way I can, any way I want, more like, and it's very easy. Some resins have different mixing ratios, and basically you want to make sure that it's something that is humanely possible for you to pull off. You don't want a resin that has proportions that are so complicated that you will inevitably keep getting them wrong. Another thing is you need to find out whether your resin requires pressure casting. Some resins do. You don't want to get one of them if you don't want to pressure cast your dolls. And obviously you probably don't want to do this if you plan to do it on your own, because that's a huge investment. I'm sorry. And basically people who sell resin are very knowledgeable, and usually they're very, very nice and happy to answer all your questions. So if you don't understand something that's written on the page, or if you don't know something, if something is not mentioned there, go ahead and ask them. You are going to need some basic knowledge to explain what your problem actually is, and I will be making a tutorial that will teach you the basic vocabulary that you need to get along with these guys. But typically you could even just straight up tell them what you want to do. Tell them that you're making a doll and it has to be this and this, and you have these particular criteria for your resin, and they will be happy to help and probably also able. Okay, that's it. These are the basics. Please ask any other questions you might have. I'll be happy to answer either right in the comments or in a future video. There is much more coming. If you want to see the whole list of tutorials that are coming up, go to my doll Tumblr or go to my Patreon page. Yes, these things are funded by my Patreon campaign, so please follow the link which will appear here and check it out. There are many awesome things you can get as rewards for donating, and many things that will happen which are also hopefully awesome as I reach some funding goals. So give me your comments, give me your opinions, give me your questions, and see you hopefully very soon. Next tutorial coming in 2 weeks. Bye!